On the morning of November 9th, 1979, at approximately 3 o'clock, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski received a phone call that would test whether a single human error could end civilization. His military assistant, General William Odom, delivered the most terrifying message imaginable. The Soviet Union had launched 220 nuclear missiles at the United States. Brzezinski had between 3 and 7 minutes to wake President Jimmy Carter and recommend full-scale nuclear retaliation. Before he could reach for the phone to call the president, Odom called back with an update that made the situation exponentially worse. The number of incoming Soviet missiles wasn't 220. It was 2,200. At military installations across the United States, alarms were screaming. At NORAD headquarters in Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, screens showed a massive Soviet first strike underway. At the Strategic Air Command Post in Offutt Air Force Base, nuclear-armed bombers were being prepared for immediate takeoff. At Fort Ritchie in Maryland, and at the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, officers were implementing protocols for launching America's nuclear arsenal in retaliation. The Worldwide Military Command and Control System, known as WIMAX, had detected what appeared to be the opening salvo of World War III. WIMAX was so sophisticated that it had automated authority to unilaterally order preparations for war, including elevating the defense condition and scrambling bombers carrying nuclear weapons. As Brzezinski prepared to make the call that would unleash Armageddon, he received a third phone call. The United States Early Warning Systems, installations that measure seismic activity and other scientific readings that always accompany ground-based missile launches, were reporting nothing. No launches, no missiles, no attack. Additional systems checks revealed the horrifying truth. The entire crisis was a false alarm. Investigation determined what had happened. A lieutenant colonel at NORAD headquarters had been given access to the wrong computer system. He had accidentally inserted a training simulation tape into the operational component of WIMAX. The sophisticated defense computer, designed to process information so quickly it could make life or death decisions in seconds, couldn't distinguish between a training exercise and reality. It interpreted the simulation of a Soviet attack as an actual attack and initiated real-world protocols for nuclear war. The incident sent shockwaves through the international community. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev wrote to President Carter that the false alarm was fraught with tremendous danger. In a letter dripping with understated menace, Brezhnev noted, "I think you will agree with me that there should be no errors in such matters." But there were more errors. In the months following the November incident, NORAD experienced 3 additional false alarms, 2 caused by faulty computer chips. One of them forced the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, the Airborne Command Center designed to survive a nuclear attack, to taxi into position at Andrews Air Force Base in preparation for takeoff. The most famous nuclear near-miss came 4 years later. On September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty at Serpukhov 15, a bunker near Moscow that housed the Soviet Union's satellite-based early warning system, codenamed OKO. Shortly after midnight, the system's alarms began screaming. OKO's computers reported that the United States had launched 1 intercontinental ballistic missile toward the Soviet Union. Moments later, the system updated. Now it showed 5 missiles inbound. Soviet military doctrine was explicit. Detection of an American missile launch required immediate notification of superiors, who would order a full-scale retaliatory strike. The strategy was called launch on warning. If American missiles were in the air, Soviet missiles would be launched before the American warheads could destroy the launch sites. Petrov had seconds to decide whether to report the attack. Relations between the superpowers were catastrophically tense. 3 weeks earlier, the Soviets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard, including an American congressman. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov was convinced that American President Ronald Reagan was preparing a decapitation strike, a surprise nuclear attack designed to destroy Soviet leadership and command systems. The KGB had placed Soviet forces on hair-trigger alert, primed to interpret any anomaly as the opening move of American aggression. But Petrov noticed something that didn't make sense. American nuclear doctrine called for an overwhelming first strike involving hundreds of missiles to eliminate any possibility of retaliation. 5 missiles made no strategic sense. Additionally, Petrov had been directly involved in upgrading OKO's computer systems and knew they were prone to malfunctions. He made a decision that may have saved billions of lives. He reported the alarm as a false positive and waited for confirmation from other systems. No confirmation came because no missiles existed. Investigation later revealed that the satellite system had misinterpreted sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds near Montana as missile launches. Petrov's decision to trust his judgment over the computers prevented what intelligence experts now call the closest the world came to accidental nuclear war. The incident remained classified for decades. Petrov received no recognition at the time and was actually reprimanded for not filing proper paperwork about the malfunction. It wasn't until after the Cold War ended that his actions became public. He was awarded humanitarian honors by the United Nations and died in May 2017, largely unknown despite having prevented nuclear holocaust. These incidents reveal a terrifying reality. During the Cold War, the fate of human civilization rested not on the wisdom of presidents or the strategy of generals, but on individual officers making split-second decisions under impossible pressure, while sophisticated computer systems screamed that nuclear war had begun. A single officer inserting the wrong tape into the wrong machine nearly triggered World War III. A satellite misinterpreting sunlight nearly caused mutual assured destruction. The machinery designed to protect humanity from nuclear war repeatedly brought humanity to the brink of extinction through false alarms, equipment failures, and human error. In 2008, parents across China began rushing their infants to hospitals with symptoms that doctors couldn't initially explain. Babies were developing kidney stones, an extremely rare condition in infants. Some were experiencing complete kidney failure. Emergency rooms filled with sick children whose parents had no idea what was poisoning them. The source was eventually traced to infant formula contaminated with melamine, an industrial chemical used in plastics and fertilizers. The Sanlu Group, one of China's largest dairy producers, had been selling baby formula containing melamine for months. The company's leadership knew about contamination, but continued distribution to avoid financial losses. What made the disaster possible was a cost-cutting decision at multiple levels of the supply chain. Dairy farmers, squeezed by low milk prices, began adding melamine to watered-down milk to increase its apparent protein content. Melamine contains high levels of nitrogen, which protein tests measured. By diluting milk with water and adding melamine, farmers could sell more product while appearing to meet protein standards. Sanlu Group accepted this contaminated milk without adequate testing. The company's quality control had been deliberately weakened to reduce costs. When initial reports of sick children reached company executives, they suppressed the information. The contamination wasn't limited to one company. Melamine had infiltrated the supply chains of 22 dairy companies across China, but Sanlu was the largest and most negligent. By the time authorities ordered recalls in September 2008, the damage was catastrophic. Official figures reported that approximately 300,000 children were affected. 6 babies died from kidney failure. An estimated 54,000 infants required hospitalization. Thousands more suffered kidney damage that would affect them for life. The actual numbers were likely much higher, as many families in rural areas never received proper medical evaluation. Investigation revealed that Sanlu executives had known about melamine contamination for months before the public disclosure. Internal company documents showed that tests had detected melamine as early as August 2007, more than a year before the recall. The company's chief executive and other officials made a calculated decision to continue selling contaminated formula rather than absorbing the financial cost of a recall. Criminal trials followed swiftly. The head of Sanlu Group received a death sentence, later commuted to life imprisonment. Several other executives received lengthy prison terms. Dairy farmers who added melamine to milk were also prosecuted, with some receiving death sentences that were carried out. The scandal destroyed public confidence in Chinese dairy products and led to a surge in demand for foreign infant formula. The Chinese government implemented new food safety regulations and increased inspections, but the damage to the industry's reputation proved irreversible. What makes this case particularly devastating is that it wasn't an accident. The contamination resulted from systematic fraud driven by profit maximization, cost-cutting decisions at every level of production, from farmers watering down milk to corporate executives disabling quality controls, created conditions for industrial-scale poisoning of infants. In 1918, the global influenza pandemic was beginning to wane after killing tens of millions worldwide. But in the remote village of Brevig Mission, Alaska, something unusual was happening. The flu had killed 85% of the village's adult population in just 5 days. Bodies were buried in mass graves in the permafrost. 72 years later, in 1990, scientists interested in understanding the 1918 flu virus obtained permission to exhume bodies from the Brevig Mission graves. The permafrost had preserved tissue samples in near-perfect condition. Researchers extracted lung tissue containing fragments of the virus that had caused the deadliest pandemic in modern history. What those researchers didn't fully appreciate was the risk they were creating. The tissue samples were shipped across international borders to laboratories for analysis. Standard protocols for handling remains of plague victims, protocols designed to prevent the accidental release of still viable pathogens, were either not followed or didn't exist for this specific situation. While no outbreak resulted from the Brevig Mission exhumations, the incident highlighted a terrifying vulnerability in how we handle the dead. Throughout history, the transportation of bodies has occasionally reintroduced diseases to new populations. In the medieval period, ships carrying corpses of plague victims inadvertently spread the Black Death to new ports when rats aboard the vessels carried infected fleas ashore. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, shipping bodies home from colonial outposts for burial sometimes reintroduced tropical diseases to Europe. One documented case involved the transport of a plague victim whose improperly sealed casket leaked fluids containing the bacteria. While the resulting outbreak was small, it demonstrated that the dead can kill as efficiently as the living when pathogens remain viable in corpses. The modern version of this risk involves refrigerated air transport of bodies across continents. Diseases like Ebola, which can survive in corpses for days, pose genuine risks if bodies are not handled with appropriate containment. Several suspected cases of disease transmission through body repatriation have been investigated, though definitive proof is often difficult to establish. In the early 2000s, a research laboratory working on developing disease-resistant crop varieties created a hybrid fungal strain designed to combat wheat rust, a fungal disease that destroys wheat crops. The modified mold was supposed to target only specific rust pathogens, while leaving wheat plants unharmed. Initial greenhouse tests showed promising results. The hybrid mold attacked rust infections aggressively and appeared to leave wheat undamaged. Researchers published papers and prepared for field trials. But when the modified mold was introduced into agricultural test plots, something went catastrophically wrong. The hybrid proved far more aggressive than laboratory tests had predicted. Instead of limiting itself to attacking rust pathogens, it began infecting healthy wheat plants directly. Worse, the modified strain was resistant to fungicides that controlled natural mold species. It spread with devastating speed across monoculture wheat fields. Within a single growing season, the mold had escaped the test plots and infected commercial wheat farms across an entire agricultural region. The fungal spores traveled on wind currents, in soil, on farm equipment, and on the clothing of agricultural workers. Each infected field became a new source of spores, spreading to neighboring farms. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Wheat yields in affected regions dropped by more than 70%. Flour prices spiked. Food shortages began affecting populations dependent on wheat as a staple crop. Government agriculture departments attempted quarantine measures, but containing airborne fungal spores across thousands of square miles proved impossible. The hybrid mold's resistance to conventional treatments meant farmers had no effective response. By the time researchers developed a new fungicide specifically targeting the hybrid strain, several growing seasons had been lost, and the economic damage measured in billions. The modified mold eventually burned itself out, likely mutating into less aggressive forms or encountering environmental conditions that limited its spread. But the incident exposed the dangers of releasing modified organisms designed to be more aggressive and resistant than their natural counterparts. The scientist who created the hybrid had intended to help farmers by protecting crops from disease. They conducted tests they believed were adequate to ensure safety, but they failed to predict how the organism would behave in real-world agricultural conditions outside the controlled environment of laboratories and greenhouses. The result was an ecological disaster that destroyed livelihoods and threatened food security for millions. During a military operation in a disputed region, a soldier manning a weapons control system received ambiguous data suggesting hostile forces were gathering in a particular grid coordinate. Standard engagement protocols required confirmation before firing on populated areas, but communication systems were degraded due to atmospheric conditions and electronic countermeasures. The soldier requested clarification from command, but received garbled responses. The weapons system showed what appeared to be multiple vehicle signatures in the target zone. Intelligence briefings had warned that enemy forces were using civilian areas to stage attacks, making it difficult to distinguish between legitimate military targets and non-combatants. Under pressure to prevent a potential attack on friendly positions, and with communication to higher command intermittent, the soldier made a decision to engage. The weapons system, a sophisticated platform capable of striking targets with precision munitions, launched its payload. The missiles struck the target coordinates with devastating accuracy, but instead of hitting enemy combatants, they obliterated a civilian convoy. Families fleeing the conflict zone were incinerated instantly. The death toll exceeded 200, mostly women and children. Investigation revealed multiple failures that contributed to the tragedy. The vehicle signatures detected by sensors had been civilian trucks and cars, but the system's identification algorithms, trained primarily on military vehicles, flagged them as potential threats. The atmospheric conditions that degraded communications also interfered with other surveillance systems that might have provided clearer identification. The intelligence briefing about enemy forces using civilian areas as cover created a mindset that interpreted ambiguous data as hostile. Most critically, the weapon system lacked adequate safeguards to prevent engagement when target identification was uncertain. The system allowed a single operator to authorize strikes without requiring confirmation from multiple sources when communications were degraded. The soldier who authorized the strike was not criminally charged but was removed from duty. Military investigators concluded that while the decision was erroneous, it resulted from systemic failures rather than individual negligence. The incident triggered international outrage and calls for stricter rules of engagement. Military forces revised protocols to require higher authorization levels for strikes in areas where civilian presence was possible, even when communications were degraded. But for the families destroyed in the attack, these improvements came too late. The tragedy demonstrated how modern warfare's reliance on complex targeting systems, combined with communication failures and ambiguous intelligence, can transform a soldier's split-second decision into a massacre. In the 1960s, agricultural regulators approved a new insecticide that promised to revolutionize pest control. The chemical, marketed as environmentally safe because it broke down quickly in sunlight, was promoted as a replacement for DDT and other persistent pesticides that had been linked to environmental damage. Laboratory tests showed the insecticide effectively killed agricultural pests while appearing to have minimal impact on other insects. The chemical degraded rapidly when exposed to ultraviolet light, which manufacturers claimed meant it wouldn't accumulate in the environment like DDT had. Regulators, under pressure to approve alternatives to banned pesticides, fast-tracked the approval based on limited testing. What the initial tests failed to detect was the chemical's impact on beneficial insects, particularly pollinators. The insecticide didn't just kill agricultural pests, it was equally lethal to bees, butterflies, and other pollinating insects. While the chemical degraded quickly in direct sunlight, it persisted much longer in shaded areas, in soil, and inside plant tissues. Flowers in treated fields absorbed the chemical and delivered fatal doses to any pollinator that visited them. Within 2 years of widespread adoption, bee populations in heavily agricultural regions began collapsing. Commercial beekeepers reported hive losses of 70 to 90%. Wild pollinator populations showed similarly catastrophic declines. The crisis rippled through ecosystems with terrifying speed. Crops dependent on insect pollination, including many fruits and vegetables, showed drastically reduced yields. Farmers who had adopted the insecticide to increase production instead watched their harvests fail. The economic impact measured in billions as agricultural systems dependent on pollination ground toward collapse. Natural ecosystems suffered even more severe damage. Flowering plants that depended on insect pollination failed to reproduce. Bird species that fed on insects faced starvation. Aquatic ecosystems downstream from treated fields experienced mass die-offs as the chemical washed into waterways, killing aquatic insects that formed the base of the food chain. The regulator who had approved the insecticide based on incomplete testing faced intense scrutiny. Investigation revealed that approval had been granted based primarily on manufacturer-provided data and short-term laboratory studies. Long-term field trials that might have detected the impact on pollinators had not been required. The chemical was eventually banned, but recovery took decades. Pollinator populations in some regions never fully recovered. Plant species dependent on specific pollinator insects went extinct. Agricultural regions shifted to crops that didn't require insect pollination or relied on costly hand pollination and managed honeybee colonies trucked in from unaffected areas. The disaster led to more stringent pesticide testing requirements, including mandatory assessment of impacts on non-target species and long-term ecosystem effects. But the damage demonstrated how regulatory shortcuts and insufficient testing can transform a chemical meant to protect crops into an agent of ecological collapse. In the mid-20th century, a biochemist working on developing vaccines faced a contamination problem that seemed minor at the time. Some batches of vaccine showed the presence of a virus that infected the monkey kidney cells used to culture the vaccine. The virus, later designated SV40, didn't appear to cause disease in monkeys or in humans during initial testing. After brief consideration, the decision was made to continue using vaccine batches that contained low levels of SV40 contamination. The alternative would have been to destroy millions of doses and delay vaccination campaigns against polio, a disease that was crippling and killing thousands of children annually. Between 1955 and 1963, approximately 100 million people worldwide received polio vaccines contaminated with SV40. The virus was injected directly into their bloodstreams. For years, this was considered an unfortunate but harmless contamination. SV40 appeared to cause no immediate illness in humans. But decades later, researchers began finding something disturbing. SV40 virus was present in certain types of human cancers, particularly brain tumors and mesotheliomas, at rates much higher than chance would predict. Laboratory studies showed that SV40 could transform normal human cells into cancer cells. Animal studies demonstrated that the virus caused tumors in rodents. The evidence suggested, though never definitively proved, that SV40 contamination in vaccines may have contributed to cancer cases that appeared decades after vaccination. The exact impact remains controversial and difficult to quantify. Cancer has multiple causes and develops over many years. making it extremely difficult to establish causation between a viral exposure in childhood and cancer appearing 40 or 50 years later. Statistical studies have shown conflicting results, with some suggesting a correlation between SV40 contaminated vaccines and certain cancers, while others find no clear link. What's undisputed is that 100 million people were exposed to a cancer-causing virus through a vaccine meant to protect them. The contamination resulted from inadequate screening of the biological materials used in vaccine production and a decision to prioritize immediate public health benefits over potential long-term risks. The incident transformed vaccine safety protocols. Modern vaccines undergo extensive testing for contaminating viruses. Cell lines used for vaccine production are exhaustively screened. Regulatory standards require demonstration that vaccines are free from adventitious agents. But for the generation that received SV40 contaminated polio vaccines, these improvements came too late. If even a fraction of the suggested cancer cases resulted from the contamination, the death toll from a biochemist's decision to use imperfectly screened vaccine stocks could number in the thousands. The tragedy illustrates how errors in medical production, even when made with good intentions and in pursuit of legitimate public health goals, can have consequences that echo across generations, killing people decades after the original mistake was made.